Welcome to Inside East African Politics. We're going to do another deep dive today looking at some, well, really complex and pretty fascinating political shifts.
Yeah, happening right now in East Africa, specifically Ethiopia and the Tigray region.
Exactly. We've got quite a collection of sources here, articles, various reports, and notes you've shared, all giving different angles on this unfolding situation.
Different perspectives, definitely.
So our mission, really, is to unpack all this together, try to make sense of these big changes and understand what's driving them, particularly focusing on one key figure who seems to be right in the middle of it all.
You're talking about Getachew Reda?
That's the one. We'll look at his journey, the major changes happening inside the TPLF, the Tigray People's Liberation Front, and the role of the National Electoral Board of Ethiopia, the NEBE.
And how all these pieces kind of fit together or maybe clash, and what it means for Tigray's future and Ethiopia's too.
Right, because this isn't just abstract politics, is it? The sources really paint a picture of intense power struggles.
Oh yeah. Legal battles, questions about a peace deal holding up. It's happening in a place still recovering from conflict. It's incredibly dynamic.
Okay, let's dive right in then. The figure at the center, as you said, Getachew Reda, his background seems, well, different.
It really does. Born June 1974, which was a hugely turbulent time in Ethiopia anyway.
Right.
But his path into politics wasn't the standard one for TPLF figures of a certain generation.
How so?
Well, look at his education. Law degrees from Addis Ababa University, then a master's from the University of Alabama. It's an academic route.
Not the typical grassroots organizer or armed struggle experience you see with many older TPLF leaders.
Exactly. The sources suggest he kind of bypassed that. He was elected to the Central Committee relatively early on, apparently without that long history in the trenches, so to speak.
Which maybe suggests a different approach. More pragmatic, maybe? Intellectual?
Perhaps. And you see this reflected later.
Yeah.
During the Tigray War, 2020 to 2024, he was the TPLF's chief spokesperson.
A very visible role?
Hugely visible. And the sources describe him as being very sharp, very strategic, and challenging narratives. He was even called, I think the term used was a propaganda machine, effectively building diplomatic support.
Quite a label. Then, after the fighting stopped with the Pretoria Agreement in late 2022, he became interim president of Tigray.
Right. Stepping into a leadership role post-conflict. There was some hope, reading between the lines in the sources, that maybe his profile could help attract aid, help foster cooperation needed for reconstruction.
But it wasn't smooth sailing within the TPLF itself, was it?
No, far from it. The divisions that were maybe simmering seemed to just boil over.
Yeah.
By August 2024, it became very public.
What happened?
Getachew, who was also the party's vice chairperson then, refused to participate in the TPLF's 14th Congress. He basically said it wasn't legitimate.
So he didn't just boycott, he challenged its validity.
And chaired a parallel conference instead. Declared the main one null and void. It was a massive public break.
What were the specific complaints from his side? What were they accusing the main TPLF leadership, Debretsion Gebremichael's faction of?
Really serious stuff. The sources say Getachew's faction accused them of staging an official coup against the regional government.
A coup?
That's the term used. And unlawfully seizing control of key resources and institutions. They mentioned the mining sector specifically and the Tigray Development Association. Basically calling the other side corrupt bureaucrats who were monopolizing power.
Wow. Strong language. How did the Debretsion faction respond?
They hit back hard. By October 2024, they formally expelled Getachew and his key allies from the party.
So kicked them out.
Yeah. And their counter-accusations, according to the material, included things like embezzlement and undermining the party's authority. It's described as one of the biggest crises, maybe the biggest challenge, in the TPLF's whole 50-year history. It really fractured that core.
So Getachew's formally out of the traditional TPLF structure, and then things shift again. He's replaced as interim president in March 2025.
By LT General Tigray Reda, yeah. An appointment reportedly linked to federal directives.
And then just a month later, April 2025, Getachew pops up in a new federal role, advisor to Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed on East African affairs, with ministerial rank.
Quite a turn of events. Which brings us right to the National Electoral Board of Ethiopia, the NEBE.
Okay, so NEBE, their role is...
They're the official body that regulates political parties, manages registrations, oversees elections nationwide. Think of them as the election commission, basically.
And they have rules for how parties get registered and stay registered.
Exactly. There's a whole process outlined in Ethiopian law. Proclamations 11/33 and 11/62 are mentioned in the sources. They include things like provisional licenses, sort of temporary permits.
Like a starter permit?
Kind of. Gives a group maybe 3 months, extendable, to get all their ducks in a row for full registration.
And what does full registration involve? What do parties need to show?
Things like having a minimum number of members, 10,000 for national parties, with rules about regional spread. They need approved bylaws, a party program. They need to show their leaders were democratically elected.
And importantly,
They can't be based on promoting ethnic or religious division, and they can't advocate violence. The NEBE checks all this.
okay. So how did the NEBE get involved with the TPLF situation amidst this big internal split?
Well, this is crucial. In May 2025, the NEBE deregistered the TPLF, took away their legal status as a party.
Deregistered them entirely. Why?
The official reason cited by NEBE was that the TPLF failed to hold a General Assembly, which is required by law. This came after they'd already been suspended for a period.
It's huge, effectively erasing the historical TPLF from the legal political map from NEBE's perspective. How did the TPLF leadership, the Debretsion faction, react to that?
They are fiercely contesting it. Their whole argument hinges on the Pretoria Peace Agreement from November 2022.
The agreement that ended the war.
Right. They argue that agreement implicitly, sort of automatically, reinstated their legal status from before the war. So they're saying needing to re-register now is moot. It shouldn't even be a question.
So they see the peace deal itself as protecting their status.
That's their interpretation. They view the NEPE's action as a unilateral move by the federal government, essentially breaking the spirit, if not the letter, of the peace deal. They call it a serious threat to the whole peace process.
Have they done anything about it?
Yes, they've appealed to the African Union. They want the AU to step in, mediate, put pressure on the federal government. It boils down to this fundamental clash. Does a national electoral law apply, as NEBE says, or does their reading of the Pretoria Agreement take precedence?
A major point of contention. Now, while this is going on, Getachew Reda's faction, they're doing something different regarding party registration.
Exactly. And this is where, looking at the sequence and the sources, it starts to look like a potential strategy. While the traditional TPLF is fighting the NEBE to keep its registration, Getachew's group is actively seeking registration for a new party.
A new party?
Yeah, the name mentioned tentatively is the Tigray Liberal Democratic Party, TLDP, and they are going through the NEBE process.
And have they had any success?
Yes. Critically, the sources state they've received a provisional license from the NEBE.
Okay, let's pause there. The NEBE deregisters the old TPLF leadership's party, citing legal non-compliance.
While simultaneously granting a provisional license to the breakaway faction led by Getachew.
How are people interpreting that timing and those actions?
Well, the interpretation laid out in the material we have is that this isn't just a coincidence. It's seen by many observers as a deliberate political strategy from the federal government.
A strategy to do what?
To use the legal tools of the NEBE to sideline the traditional TPLF leadership, the Debretsion faction, by strictly enforcing registration rules on them. And at the same time, to facilitate and promote an alternative political force within Tigray, the TLDP, which might be, let's say, more cooperative or aligned with the federal center.
So it connects to Prime Minister Abiy's broader goals.
That's the analysis presented. It aligns with the objective of building a more cohesive, perhaps more centralized state, and specifically with the stated aim of centralizing authority in Tigray.
So it's maybe less about direct federal control and more about influencing Tigrayan politics through a Tigrayan actor perceived as more amenable.
That seems to be the interpretation, a kind of political engineering using legal mechanisms. And Getachew's appointment as a federal advisor, coming after he was replaced as interim president by General Tedesz, whose own appointment had federal links. It all seems to fit into this picture, according to the sources.
Right. So what does all this mean on the ground inside Tigray? What are the implications of this TPLF split being formalized and the rise of the TLDP?
Well, first, it obviously cements that power struggle. It's no longer just an internal party fight. It's potentially a contest between different registered or provisionally registered parties.
Could it lead to more political choice, more pluralism?
That's a possibility raised. The sources mention other parties already exist in Tigray Arena Tigray, TPP, Baytona, and coalitions like Kid-Integaru. Some of these groups apparently feel the old TPLF was losing touch, especially with younger people. So maybe this opens up space.
But what about the administration running Tigray right now, the Tigray Interim Administration, the TIA?
Its job becomes much harder. The effectiveness of the TIA is really hampered by this split. Remember those official coup accusations from Getachew's side against the Debretsion faction, claiming they seized institutions? That undermines the TIA's credibility and ability to govern, especially when it comes to post-conflict recovery.
And recovery includes that whole DDRR process for ex-fighters, right?
Mhm.
Disarmament, demobilization.
Rehabilitation and reintegration. Yes, the DDRR program. It's already stalled, partly because it depends on the withdrawal of Amhara and Eritrean forces from certain areas, which the sources say hasn't fully happened.
How does the split affect that?
Well, it adds another layer of complexity. Interestingly, Getachew's faction, the TLDP group, has apparently proposed ideas like integrating some eligible former fighters into the federal army, the ENDF, and others into regional forces, but under civilian control. This approach sounds potentially more aligned with federal aims to centralize security.
Okay, let's come back to the Pretoria Agreement again, because it seems like the absolute crux of the legal dispute over the TPLF's status.
It really is. You have two completely opposing views of what it means.
The TPLF view is.
Their view, the Debretsion faction's view, is that Pretoria is the supreme legal framework. It overrides other laws in this context, and they believe it implicitly guaranteed their pre-war legal status, making NEBE's demand for re-registration totally illegitimate. They see NEBE's action as a violation of trust, a danger to the peace.
But the federal government and NEBE acting on its authority see it differently.
Completely differently. Their position seems to be, the peace deal is one thing, but national electoral law applies to everyone. All parties have to follow Proclamation 1162. They frame the TPLF's registration as just an administrative issue under NEBE's mandate, something the peace deal didn't specifically shield them from in this way.
So a fundamental disagreement about which law takes priority.
Exactly. And the sources suggest the peace agreement itself might have been ambiguous on this specific point, post-war party registration, leaving room for these conflicting interpretations to become a major battleground.
And that's why the TPLF took their case to the African Union.
Precisely. They're looking for external mediation, trying to get the AU to pressure Addis Ababa, arguing the whole peace process is at risk. And it's worth noting, the sources also mentioned the TPLF leadership feels the Pretoria Agreement generally doesn't do enough to protect Tigray's constitutional rights or guarantee its proper place in the federation. So the dissatisfaction seems broader than just the registration issue.
Okay, stepping back from Tigray itself, what are the wider implications of all this for Ethiopia as a whole?
Oh, they're significant. This whole situation is a major test for Ethiopia's peace, which is still quite fragile, and for the federal system itself.
How does it impact things like national reconciliation or upcoming elections? Elections are due by June 2026, right?
Yes. And this complicates things massively. There were supposed to be remedial elections held in Tigray because they missed the last ones due to the war. But how do you hold credible elections there now with the historic ruling party deregistered by NEBE, this deep internal split and ongoing tensions?
Could new parties like the TLDP actually add healthy competition?
In theory, yes. More choice could be good. But the way this is happening with the TPLF being pushed out legally while the TLDP is facilitated carries huge risks. There's a real concern voiced in the sources that if the traditional TPLF feels completely excluded from formal politics, elements might be radicalized.
Could it lead back to violence?
That's the fear. That it could undermine stability not just in Tigray, but potentially reignite wider tensions. Some sources even mention the internal split could risk becoming a proxy conflict, perhaps involving Eritrea or just generally destabilizing the region further.
Is there any potential positive path through this? Could Getachew's party offer a way forward?
Well, the optimistic scenario, perhaps, is if the TLDP manages to gain real legitimacy and support within Tigray, and if it successfully integrates into the national political system, that could create a more cooperative relationship between Tigray and the federal government, fostering stability.
But that's a big if.
A very big if, because the risk on the other side is huge. If the TLDP is just seen by ordinary Tigrayans as a puppet of the federal government, if the NEBE's actions are perceived as unfair political interference that violates the spirit of Pretoria, well, that could backfire badly.
How so?
It could re-radicalize people, fuel more resentment, potentially lead to more instability, maybe even armed resistance from those who feel their political voice has been taken away. The success of this federal strategy, as interpreted, really seems to depend on whether the TLDP can win genuine hearts and minds in Tigray, not just be seen as federally imposed. Failure could mean a much messier, more fragmented conflict landscape.
Okay, This has definitely been a deep dive into a very complex and shifting situation. We've tracked Getachew Reda's quite unusual path, the dramatic split within the TPLF that's now becoming formalized.
The key role of the NEBE in deregistering one side while licensing the other, this new TLDP party emerging.
And how it all revolves around these clashing interpretations of the Pretoria Peace Agreement.
It really feels like a pivotal moment, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It could genuinely reshape Tigray's politics and its place within Ethiopia for a long time.
And the way forward looks, well, incredibly challenging. Navigating these legal fights, the contested peace deal, trying to build dialogue when there's so much mistrust.
Absolutely. The stakes feel incredibly high for peace and stability in the entire region.
So a final thought to leave you, the listener, with.
Mm-hmm.
Considering this history, these deep divisions we've discussed, and what appears to be the federal strategy playing out, what do you think the most likely long-term impact will be on Ethiopian federalism, on lasting peace in Tigray? And with the TPLF appealing to the EAU, what role can or should international bodies play now? Lots to think about.